Hello. Our story begins on the dried planet of Mustafar. Kylo Ren, the Supreme Leader of the First Order, was raging through a band of local inhabitants. The planet had changed greatly since his grandfather called this place home. Mustafar used to be covered in a planet of lava, but now the land had healed and vegetation began to grow. Kylo Ren was here looking for something, one of the two Sith wayfinders in the galaxy that could lead him to find the Sith homeworld of Exegol. It was an ancient place in the galaxy, similar in age and importance to the Sith as other planets. Exegol was a bit more secret than Korriban or Malachor, and Kylo was drawn here because the dead were speaking. Once Kylo and his men killed off the native inhabitants of the planet, he took the TIE Silencer through space towards the planet of Exegol. Kylo was hell-bent on finding this voice that called out across the galaxy. This was the true one threat in the galaxy to him as Supreme Leader. When he arrived at Exegol, he stormed towards the voice of Palpatine. As he did, he heard voices of his grandfather, Darth Vader, Snoke, and the Emperor himself. The voices rang out through his ears while he descended an elevator and walked into a laboratory. Inside the laboratory, there were disjointed Snoke clones inside of massive tubes. There was also a severed hand sitting alone in a tube too. That hand belonged to Luke Skywalker. Kylo walked past the individuals in here, walking towards the source of the voice. When he came around, he was able to find himself at the voice itself, and he couldn't believe his eyes. The Emperor had survived, resurrected by the power of the dark side of the Force, and yet he was nothing, suspended over Kylo, held together by circuits and torn apart by the Force itself. No wonder Kylo never felt his presence. He was essentially cut off from the Force. Palpatine waited until Skywalker was gone, and then he returned, knowing that Luke could be the only one individual in the galaxy able to stop him and take his power away from him. Palpatine struck up a deal with the grandson of his former student. The reason he did so was because he was going to use Kylo Ren to kill his granddaughter, and essentially turn Kylo into his pawn. Why wouldn't he think he could get away with that? He did it to Vader for more than 2 decades. Though Kylo wasn't having any of it. He wasn't going to allow this Emperor to control him. As he raised his lightsaber to strike down the Emperor, Palpatine used the little force he had to push him away with the Force. His evil guard came running in, and Ren reacted by deflecting blaster bolts and fighting back every guardsman until each and every single one of them were dead. Palpatine mustered up enough strength to fire lightning at Kylo, but it proved to be no avail to the Supreme Leader as he cut down his only rival on the dark side of the Force. Palpatine's body fell into pieces before Kylo as he turned around and investigated what was here on Exegol. It wouldn't take him long to learn that the Final Order began here on Exegol. The Final Order was something that had been worked on for the longest time, with contributions from heroes of the Age of the Empire, such as General Hux's father, Grand Admiral Rey Salone, Moff Gideon, General Pride, and of course Grand Admiral Thrawn himself. It all led to this. It's something that General Hux obviously didn't want his Supreme Leader to know about. Ren would deal with that another time. For now, he was going to see if this fleet was operable. It was. Kylo would discover that the Final Order was fully outfitted with the children of families of the former Empire. These were the purest loyalists from all across the galaxy, which meant for Kylo, he'd expand upon what the First Order already had. In a very short time, the First Order was able to instill wide fear into the people across the galaxy, and now he could control them, and he could take over the galaxy for himself. In his mind, he could become the greatest ruler in the history of the galaxy, and he could show so much strength that the entire galaxy would bend to his knees. The Final Order rose, and Kylo would be at the helm of all of it, alongside of General Pride, of course. Across the galaxy on Ajan Claws, Rey was continuing her training with Leia. She had come into very far into her training thanks to Luke, and Leia was picking up right where her brother left off. Leia had a complete set of knowledge needed to train Rey, thanks to the time she spent training with Luke. The only reason she stopped training was due to a vision she had of her son falling to the dark side. She believed that in stopping, she would resolve the problem, but it had the opposite effect. The tragedy that beset the Skywalker family was visions of the Force coming true when they tried to prevent them from coming true. It's the same fate that turned Anakin into Vader. Regardless, Leia was training Rey to be the final stand against her son. There were no other Jedi left in the galaxy, and at this point, Leia wasn't equipped enough to fight her son in combat. He may have been too arrogant the first time he faced Rey, but he wouldn't fall into the same pit of failure this time. One of Leia's first lessons for Rey was showing her how to create her own lightsaber. Being that Anakin's lightsaber was destroyed during the Battle of Crate, it was time for Rey to carry the mantle of the Jedi. Leia gifted Rey 2 crystals of a lightsaber. One belonged to her own lightsaber, and one belonged to her father. The 2 crystals would combine into a double-bladed lightsaber that Rey constructed to match her own style. The double-bladed lightsaber would match what she used her entire life, a staff. Being from the world of Jakku, she had to fight for herself. Having used those skills against Ren and the Praetorian Guard, she now constructed a lightsaber that pandered to her natural skill. With her lightsaber constructed, she would spend the rest of the year working with Leia, looking into the Force. Something Leia taught Rey, specifically, was to trust the voices of the Jedi that had come before her. Though Rey was having difficulty reaching the Jedi of the past. They weren't present anywhere, but it was just a misconception. They were waiting for Rey to pass her greatest trial, ever so similarly as Qui-Gon waiting for his pupil in Obi-Wan to find him. The Jedi of the past were there, waiting for Rey to take her next step, so that they could guide her. Leia told stories about patience to Rey, to which she took to heart, though it was hard, and that was the point. Rey went through difficult training on the daily, which meant she had to avoid being off of Ashen Claws, because it could severely interrupt her training as a Jedi. One thing that Rey struggled with was her rage. It's something she had a lot of, naturally, and even more so than that, she was naturally drawn to it. Leia knew it, and she knew why, but she didn't want to force it, she didn't want to tell her. She needed Rey to learn the reasons why herself. When the time came, she could learn it. But right now, she needed to focus on her training. Understanding the path of the Jedi, while she was training, her friends returned from a mission, which had them intercepting a spy who relayed information about the Final Order. The information told the Resistance that Palpatine had truly returned from the dead, though the information did not reveal that Palpatine had also been slayed by Kylo Ren. The spy retained enough to inform the Resistance that the Final Order would be greater than the combined strength of the First Order and the Empire at both of their peaks. Despite the Death Stars and Starkiller Base, the Final Order would be able to wipe out the entire galaxy. And it was known to the galaxy shortly after this information was revealed when the Final Order Star Destroyers exited outside of Bothawai's system, blowing the planet into nothing but debris. The galaxy was sent into fear, and it gave Supreme Leader Kylo Ren the confidence to make a shot for the core. Being that the capital of the galaxy was destroyed in the Hosnian system incident, the capital was relocated back to the galactic core, because it was the most favorable place in the galaxy. Not to mention, Coruscant had been the capital of the galaxy for so long beforehand. Though there was some reluctance because of the Hosnian system being destroyed. Not everyone on Coruscant was okay with the idea of becoming the main face of the New Republic, with a large threat like the First Order, and now the Final Order. The reason being is that the Resistance got no help from anyone. At the Battle of Crate, they called out for help, and no one came. Many people feared the First Order, though the sacrifice of Luke Skywalker inspired the galaxy and gave people hope, but many people were still very afraid of the Final Order. They went anywhere they wanted and destroyed everything that they wanted without anyone having to stop them. Regardless, when the Final Order arrived in the core, they showed strength by slamming down a stationary tower in the middle of the city and then implementing martial law. Coruscant, over the span of a planetary rotation, went completely dark. Stormtroopers and Sith troopers filled the streets and executed anyone they believed to be an agitator. A Sith trooper commander led a ground assault, enforcing curfews and capturing Resistance sympathizers. Supreme Leader Kylo Ren, on the other hand, was stationing his officers in the middle of his tower, leaving General Pride of the Final Order to command the fleet over Coruscant and putting General Hux inside the tower itself. Kylo didn't trust Hux, the two of them never seemed to get along, and even Kylo believed that Hux could be behind the data leaks from the First Order. The truth is, General Hux was behind it, but he was more interested in seeing Kylo Ren fall than the First Order fall. He believed that Ren was detrimental to the Final Order's success. At the same time, Kylo brought the Knights of Ren back to Coruscant. For the past year and a half, they'd been scavenging and killing off children of the Force, per the request of Kylo. It's where they were when Starkiller Base was destroyed, and it was where they were mere days after when Kylo Ren killed Snoke, though they were under the illusion that Rey killed Snoke. It was just a lie told by Kylo to keep his name safe. While Ren was very aware that Rey had the lineage of Palpatine, he had no interest in telling her. The reason being is that he didn't want her to know how high her ceiling really was, being that Palpatine and Yoda were the only two beings alive during the life of Anakin Skywalker that would have been able to challenge him. Kylo knew, as well as Rey did, that they were equals to each other, a powerful light and a powerful dark. They had the potential to join together in a Force dyad. However, since Rey wouldn't join Kylo in the supremacy, there was no reason to believe that she would join him now. General Pride began to dispatch Final Order destroyers out to the numerous planets, while keeping the main bulk of them present here over Coruscant to relay their power to those who didn't serve them. This strategically was fine, though the only issue was the protection for some of these destroyers. Imperial Star Destroyers, and similarly the Resurgent class Star Destroyers, were famously bad at being able to defend themselves from the attack of fighters or bombers. Of course, they could hit one now and again, but it was vital of a weakness to them. On Ajan Kloss, Rey and her allies gathered together with General Organa, as they discussed how they would strategically handle this invasion of Coruscant. Leia knew that her son would take pride in his work, but he also wouldn't be as foolish as he was with Starkiller Base. This time he would see any threat as a real threat. He wouldn't allow anyone to best him in this scenario, so the Resistance had to play the long game. Leia told Rey, Finn, Chewie, Poe, and Rose to get onto Coruscant and cause disruption, though it would need to take them time. They wouldn't be able to just rally enough people in a short period of time. They needed to win skirmishes. They needed to use sneak attacks. Poe asked his general question. Leia looked over and waited for the question. Poe asked if this would be similar to how the Ghost Squadron took Lothal during the Old War. Leia nodded her head. She told Poe that General Syndulla and her son Jason Syndulla would be joining them in 2 months. The 5 of them understood, and they would be taking a group of elite resistance enforcers to the planet and striking up resistance on Coruscant. Leia moved to other heads across the room, telling them to disperse from Ajan Kloss and go out into the galaxy to find people and help them rise up. Leia reminded all of them that the First Order won by making them feel alone at Crate, but they weren't alone. If they trusted themselves and inspired those around them, then they could win this war. It was all about how they struck at the First Order. They all dispersed. Within hours, all the fighter craft was leaving Ajan Kloss and jumping to various locations across the galaxy. It wasn't just the Final Order destroyers, there were also much larger Resurgent class destroyers everywhere. At each of these planets, a new martial law would be enforced, sometimes worse than others. The cruelest of them had civilians starving for weeks until they died. Others just had nighttime curfews, but death penalty if caught. It was a scary time for the galaxy, but Kylo underestimated the will of the people. The same people who lived through the Empire and the same people whose children grew up in the era of the Empire. This fight belonged to all of them. The only thing holding them back was an image. The only image of hope, thus far, seen across the galaxy was the strength of Luke Skywalker showed at the Battle of Crate, being the hero the galaxy needed in its final act of courage and ultimate strength. All the galaxy needed was a moment of strength, a fire if you will, a reason to rise up, a leader to follow. They collectively could do it. It just took one force to rise up, just like in the days of the Rebellion. Outside of Coruscant, the Millennium Falcon exited hyperspace. Chewie piloted the ship down into the industrial sector of the planet, which had been barren long before the era of the Empire. The Falcon flew down and flipped into the passageway into the lower levels. The city looked completely different. There were still lights on, but there were no vessels in the air. The massive tower in the middle of everything made the whole city feel eerie. It was placed down where the former temple was, as a way for Kylo to get rid of the Sith and the Jedi once and for all, considering that there was a Sith temple below that, and the Jedi temple used to be Palpatine's personal palace. No longer though, all destroyed because Kylo was going beyond this age-old rivalry of the Jedi and the Sith. He believed that there were more to bicker about, like for example where to put his retirement home after the galaxy was all his. The Millennium Falcon avoided running into individuals of the Final Order as they landed down on level 1215. When they got there, they were surprised to see how much unity there was. The Final Order hadn't yet gotten down to the lower levels of Coruscant, and because of that, the formerly rather destitute parts of the city world were not in ruins. Rather, they were standing strong. Sure, their buildings had been left in the rubble, but that was due to continuous cycles of bounty hunters, smugglers, and scum that frequented the lower areas of Coruscant. This here on level 1215 was exactly what Coruscant needed. People came together. It wasn't much, but it was the serious beginning of change. Rey, Poe, Chewie, Finn, and Rose walked through the streets, seeing workshops filled with Imperial-era tech, stuff that pirates stole from the Imperial decommissioned yard in the industrial sector. When the Empire fell, and the New Republic took over, many of the Imperial weapons were torn apart and used for other projects. Pirates and the rest of this lot would sneak into the yards and steal large pieces of walkers, tanks, and turbo lasers, whatnot if they will. It allowed their lower levels to stay in such condition, because the people with power were criminals, and those with no power didn't have ATSTs walking around, or even simple Imperial turbo lasers defending their palaces and such. The group split up. Rey and Chewie went to search lower levels for more of these rebels. Meanwhile, Poe, Finn, and Rose would begin to see where the leader was, or how large its collective of force was. The split would have the Resistance fighters apart for mere months on Coruscant. The city was huge, and as big as it was, the 5 of them stayed close in contact, finding out that there was a rebellion much larger. The Final Order couldn't get any lower than top-level street level. On Coruscant, the entire planet was just one large city, and orbital bombardments wouldn't do the job. Sure, they would detonate Coruscant, but they wouldn't gain anything from it. Kylo Ren wanted to show his strength to be eternal. He wanted planets to see that he tamed Coruscant, a planet of 4 trillion people, and with the former capital of the galaxy under his control, naturally the galaxy should bend. Though with the Final Order spread out so far in the galaxy, there were troubles. Kylo began to realize that there was much more to being Supreme Leader than just ruling, which inevitably made him bring his fist down harder on the galaxy, making curfews the least damaging part of his rule. If cities were unruly, then they would be burnt to the ground, which was actively happening on Coruscant, but the people were fighting back. Ironically, this wasn't because of the Resistance. There were 4 trillion people on Coruscant, and there were millions of civilians fighting on the upper levels of Coruscant alone. Poe, Rose, and Finn were able to unite the civilians in the lower levels, while Rey and Chewie, after bringing people to level 12-15 from above and below, went to the upper levels to unite the people on the top side of the planet, informing them of the storm that was coming. It was dangerous for Rey to be so close to the surface because she could possibly alert Kylo to her presence, but he had no clue that she was there. His focus was on the core itself, especially because Hera Syndulla and her son Jason helped inspire a massive rebellion on Anaxes, which was causing a bit of chaos for the Final Order. General Hux was sent there to deal with this outbreak, but considering he was essentially assisting it, the rebels beat him back and destroyed his fleet, killing him in the process. General Pryde suggested to Kylo that they do something instead. Kylo was open to ideas, especially since Pryde had served with the Emperor for so long, being a part of his inner circle at that. Pryde suggested a time frame, one that told every rebellious planet that if they didn't stop in 3 planetary rotations everywhere, then non-rebel sympathizing planets would be obliterated. Kylo didn't understand the motive, but Pryde explained it as, the rebels were fighting for those who couldn't fight. If the Final Order took away those who wouldn't fight, or their reason for fighting, they would just cripple and the entire Resistance galaxy-wide would stop. Of course, there were those who were fighting the fight just because they wanted to, and didn't really care about what happened to others, but that wasn't the point. For example, the Final Order could obliterate Vardos, which was a First Order, Empire-loyal planet. The reason being is everyone on the planet was innocent. It would tell the Resistance that any rebellion would cause the death of everyone, no matter who they were with. With enough ships to destroy the entire galaxy, it wouldn't be hard to inspire people to surrender. Kylo actually liked this idea. A broadcast was sent out across the entire galaxy, informing these rebellions that they collectively had 3 full planetary days on Coruscant to comply to the Final Order's demands, or they too would perish. This stopped people in the galaxy from wanting to fight, but the Resistance had a plan. Hera Syndulla, after causing a massive rebellion on Anaxes, would arrive on Coruscant with General Organa. They went down to level 12-15 because anywhere higher than that was barren at this point. All the fighters went either to 12-15 or to the surface level to fight the Final Order. Leia had a plan that involved getting her to the main complex, where her son was. This would require cooperation from all of them. They didn't have much time. While Leia was laying down this plan, Rey and Chewie were bringing rebels to the top side of the surface into hiding. This was all a part of the elaborate plan itself. The Final Order loyalists would jump at the idea of victory, and the Final Order troopers would as well. The city fighting on the top side was the most ruthless fighting since the Clone Wars. It was brutal and it didn't hesitate, which mostly meant for the Final Order, it was doing anything that would quell the insurgents. Regardless, with everything situated, all of 12-15 would relocate to the surface in the morning, all the vehicles necessary alongside all the ready troopers. At the same time, Finn, Rose, and Poe would lead a strike team to free prisoners pending execution on the far side of the city. When the Resistance struck, they would have the perfect opportunity to free those captured by the Final Order. Rey, Chewie, BB-8, and Leia would sneak into the tower to get Leia to the transmission room. Finn, Rose, and Poe, if they could, were to get to the command tower as well. With their mission incentives in place, Hera would take the prison crew across the city, using the lower levels to get there, while Leia, in her final stand against the forces of evil, would send one final message to the freedom fighters on Coruscant, telling them that this would be the day that they'd be canceling the galactic apocalypse. Today would be the day that they all came together, one final time, not just here on Coruscant but across the entire galaxy to fight tyranny, and show the forces of evil that there was nothing they could feasibly do to hold people down. That people would always rise up, and now they were. Leia said 4 more words: one path to victory. With a rousing speech shown to freedom fighters everywhere on Coruscant, they would rise at the crack of daylight and take the fight to the Final Order. Troopers of the Final Order would be blindsided. In front of the crest of the sunrise, shadows would illuminate and a terrible sound would echo down the destroyed corridors of the city. A chant would begin, and it would sting the interior of every soldier's ears. It would be heard in the skyscrapers above, and all the way to Supreme Leader Kylo Ren's throne room. One path to victory. It would continue over and over again, and then the firefight would begin. More grandeur in scale than anything ever seen before in galactic history. The Resistance rising up to fight the forces of oppression. The Resistance with walkers, speeders, tanks, gunships, anything they could get their hands on to strike at the Final Order. This fight would be epic. Across the city, on the grand prison structure, housing hundreds of thousands of prisoners awaiting their death that day, it would start with Hera, Poe, Finn, and Rose pushing down a hallway, opening up blaster fire into Sith troopers and stormtroopers alike. Meanwhile, Hera's son, a young Force wielder like his father, ran towards a control room. With all the attention being drawn to Hera and a band of Resistance fighters, the control room would be left rather unprotected. With the lack of protection, Jason, using ventilation shafts, would drop down into the command center, using the Force to throw deckhands into walls and igniting his own personal lightsaber to beat back the few guards that were there. When he opened up the cells, he played Leia's message to the Resistance. And again, as the prisoners rose up, the chant began to echo, one path to victory. Hera, Finn, Poe, and Rose were pinned down, but when the sound of cell alarms began to blast down the hallways, the stormtroopers were rerouted to another path. When they got there, they realized the prisoners had looted the barracks, and they were on the short end of the stick, being that most of the troopers in the city were currently fighting against the Resistance on the city streets. The Resistance heroes would join the prisoners in helping them escape before Hera began to usher Poe, Finn, and Rose to the center tower. Seeing this, General Pryde would suggest blowing up a planet, to which Kylo would agree to, projecting in front of the entire city a hologram of the planet of Eridu being obliterated by a Final Order destroyer. When the Freedom Fighters saw this, it only told them they needed to fight harder and they needed to get to the tower immediately. Rey and Chewie would lead the way inside the tower as they made a great push to the command center. Ren, having felt his mother's presence, released the Knights of Ren to do one thing he and his evil mind couldn't bring himself to do: kill his mother. The Knights of Ren abandoned the throne room, while a pack of Praetorian guards were dispatched to the control room. Kylo knew what was going to happen. He would stay in his throne room until his challenger arrived. Rey, Chewie, and Leia were being as stealthy as possible, taking out however many individuals they could without causing a disruption, as they made their way for the comms room inside the tower. When they got close, they were sidetracked by an attack of the Knights of Ren. Rey took them on, telling Leia, Chewie, and BB-8 to go on. Rey used a rough combination between forms 1 and 5, which was basically closer to 6, as she took on the formerly best students of Luke's academy. The Knights of Ren began to encircle her, but she couldn't allow that. Using her double-bladed lightsaber, she began to attack the Knights of Ren from every angle she could. They were a fierce group, and while it had been a while since they had a true challenge, Rey would provide enough of a challenge to them to force them to be the best fighters that they could be. The Knights of Ren pushed against Rey, jabbing at her and swinging at her, though this made her suffer from an inability to make an aggressive push against them. Her focus on defense was rather seamless, and then when she got a moment, she used the Force to lift one of the Knights of Ren off of their feet and threw them into another. She got more space between her, and now she could divide and conquer. Things were looking dreary for her, but now she had more room to work with. At the same time, Chewie and Leia broke into the command room and connected BB-8 to the power generator. Before they could broadcast a message, 8 Praetorian guards marched into the room. Leia looked at them and then looked at Chewie. She raised her hand at Chewie as her friend stopped what he was about to do, and he watched her. Leia closed her eyes, going into the Force and remembering what her brother taught her. She raised both of her hands, and the powerful warriors were taken off of their feet. They began to scramble, trying to get somewhere, but Leia wasn't having any of that. She lifted them into the ceiling and dragged them along the ceiling panels and threw them out the window, dropping them several thousands of feet to the surface of the city, to their deaths. Leia then fell to her knee and took a deep breath. Resting her hand on an adjacent panel, BB-8 rolled up to her as Chewie made his way over to her, but she told Chewie she was fine. She smiled and then told BB-8 that she was ready. A gust of wind flew through the window as her robe spun around, as she rose to her feet like a proud goddess. Leia spoke delicately and strongly to every planet across the galaxy, telling them that the seeds of hope would never fail them. Their conquest for peace and justice would never fall silently into decay, but it would rise above the troubles of the First Order and the Final Order. Leia told them all that the Force was with them, because here on Coruscant a fire was burning. It was burning hot and it was catching the city by storm. A revolution inspired by those who would never give up. The resistance would never falter. Leia stopped and paused as a wind and the distance blaster fire quickly murmured over the transmission. Leia smiled. She said, "Fight the Final Order. There's only one path to victory." The transmission ended. Every individual across the galaxy knew who Leia was, and now she completed the next step of her brother's journey, inspiring hope, and then she ignited the fire, the gift that both siblings had. Leia looked at Chewie and told them that they needed to regroup with Poe, Rose, Finn, and Hera. Chewie growled, asking about Rey, to which Leia smiled and told him that she was finishing her own journey. The Jedi of the past were with her now, and she needed to complete this leg of the journey on her own, without any of them nearby. Rey was still in the corridor defending herself from the Knights of Ren. She shoved her blade through one of them before flipping over another and cutting him down. She stopped. She could feel Kylo's presence. He was getting closer. He was very clearly not the happiest individual, and she could feel it. Rey had 3 more guards to get through. If she didn't, then she would be in trouble with the Knights of Ren and Kylo himself. Rey spun her blade around and sped up, slamming into the 2 of them. Not killing blows, but disorienting. Rey took on the final one, standing as she beat back, using a powerful 3-point saber combo that she learned and found in one of Luke's old Jedi textbooks from Mach 2. Rey slammed the knight to the ground, killing him before turning back to see Kylo Ren marching down the hallway as the other knights stood up. Kylo immediately ignited his weapon and cut them down. Rey herself was genuinely shocked. She saw Ben Solo on Ahch-To when they connected, and she saw him for a brief moment inside of Snoke's flagship. They hadn't connected in a long time, and it was because Ben Solo was dead. Kylo Ren killed him, and there was nothing remaining of Ben Solo, as he stood over the dead bodies of his former knights. Ren didn't say anything, allowing Rey to call him a monster or something, but she had nothing to say. She ran forward, slamming her lightsaber forward. Kylo was quick to back into defensive form, their lightsabers slamming down to each other. Rey using her staff-like weapon to beat back every parry that Kylo made. On the lower levels of the tower, Hera and the other groups of rebels ran into Leia and Chewie. They asked what the plan was from here. Leia told Hera that they would be resetting the command structure as a whole and shut it down, allowing it to self-destruct and hopefully claim victory. In the streets, the Resistance freedom fighters were making a dent and breaking through the Final Order's lines, crushing their walkers and pushing towards the tower. The message relayed by Leia was starting rebellions galaxy-wide, and fleets of people took to the skies to fight back. Inside the tower, Rey and Kylo were fighting along the spire, where a large ray of light was shining from. Their blades crossed across each other's as they pushed back against each other. Rey was putting up a terrific fight until Kylo swung his blade and hit the mark, cutting Rey's lightsaber into halves as she fell backwards to the floor. Ren stood over her, telling her that she should have taken his hand on Snoke's flagship. Rey looked at him. As he swung his lightsaber down at her, she slid to the side, using the Force to pull what half of her lightsaber was left. There were 2 pieces left, and she ignited the one piece she had, which was the longer piece of the hilt than the other. Rey got to her feet, parrying a strike by Kylo before swinging around, barely missing him. The tower began to rattle. Rey knew what this was. This was a part of the plan. Rey slung down and cut through Kylo's legs. As he fell to the ground, similarly to how Anakin did on Mustafar, Rey looked at him and told him that she would have taken Ben Solo's hands. He raged at her, screaming at the top of his lungs, but Rey just backed out of the room and closed the doors around him. The power structure inside the tower began to rupture. Rey ran towards a window in the structure and jumped out, looking down at the thousands of meters below her and the ground that came closing in. She closed her eyes and could feel Leia reaching out to her. When she opened her eyes, she heard the familiar ring of the Millennium Falcon. She used the Force to pad her landing on the vessel as she jumped into the topside chute that was left open for her. The tower crumbled, and as it crumbled, ships all across Coruscant rose to the air, following the Millennium Falcon and the Ghosts as they led an assault on the fleet outside of the planet. Across the galaxy, similar victory would transpire, people rallying together, piecing together old rivalries and grudges for the betterment of the galaxy. The people had one path to victory, and they found it: their togetherness, their ability to come together against the faces of oppression, and to stand up for what was right. The Resistance wouldn't be victorious. The galaxy would be, though, as the Final Order fell. The overwhelming number of people that rallied together brought in new hope to the galaxy, and while Leia was saddened about her son's choice, she was glad to have Rey with her. Leia would guide Rey forward and pass her on to the next stage of her life as a Jedi. Meanwhile, the heroes from the war would come together again to try and rebuild a democracy meant for the entire galaxy. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our story. Again, special thanks to Benjamin Wells, Target Boy, Darth Revan, Pimp Daddy Bane, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Mad Money Studios, Anakin 003, Jedi Sloth, Lemon Knight, Flynn Van Cease, and Lord Deadwing for supporting the channel. Hit 2,000 likes on this video. I don't know what's coming next, but it is. Let's start with the story real quick. So there are elements in this that are combined from Rise of Skywalker and Duel of the Fates. They were both, well, Duel of the Fates was the original storyboard kind of thing for what became the Rise of Skywalker. It was the other guy's, Howard's, I think it was Howard's film. I can't remember his name. But I thought it'd be kind of fun to combine both elements here, using Kylo killing Palpatine as the method for getting to that path, and again combining these elements from both films, which is fun. I talked about like I really like making these videos in general, but I also like making these sequel videos because I can typically play around with other villains sometimes, and getting rid of Palpatine in this video was a way for me to play with another villain. Excuse me. And so working with Kylo was fun to work with, but also working with the dynamic that he has with Rey is also fun to work with. This video probably could be like an hour and a half, but I know most people aren't going to click on it because, you know, it has the sequels in it, and people just don't want to watch that, and I get that. The point of this channel isn't to force you to like things. The point of this channel is to be for every Star Wars fan. I'm a Star Wars fan that likes all three trilogies. I like just pretty much about everything about Star Wars, except for Sid, that motherfucker from Bad Batch. She's the worst part about Star Wars. That's all I have to say. That Trandoshan from Bad Batch. I really don't dislike much about this franchise and the story, and the sequels are part of that. You know, I've accepted that they are what they are, and I accept them for what they are, and I'm liking them for what they are. You know, and that's just who I am. And this isn't me trying to force that on you. It's the same thing I do with the prequels or the original trilogy. It's just looking at it from a different perspective. Seeing if I could say, well, you looked at it from this way before, but let's see if we can take it another way. You know, it's not, you know, doing these sequel videos isn't me saying I can write better than Disney. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to write stories, as always. You know, I'm not trying to do better than George Lucas, J.J. Abrams, or Rian Johnson. That's not my goal. My goal is not to do that. My goal is to tell stories, and that's, I hope, is what I accomplish. And that's what I hope I accomplish with this story as well. This is no different than anything I've done with any of the other trilogies. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all. Spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.